The Ozarks of Missouri in 1898 looked peaceful from a distance. The rolling hills were endless, blanketed in mist at dawn, and the smell of damp wood carried through the valleys. It was a place where families were known by name, where church bells marked the rhythm of each week, and where gossip traveled faster than the wind. But even in such a quiet land, silence often hid things that no one dared to speak of. Behind the gentle creak of porches and the hum of crickets, there were stories people pretended not to see, stories like that of the Vancroft family. The Vancrofts were not poor folk. Their home stood on a hill just outside the small town of Alton, a wide wooden house with tall windows and wraparound porches, built by hands that had known both labor and wealth. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where children grew up safe, where parents laughed around dinner tables. However, locals always claimed that there was something unusual about that house, something too quiet, too still. Sometimes at dusk, you could see figures through the glass, 3 of them, sitting around the piano with not a sound escaping, even though their mouths were open in what should have been song. James Vancroft was a respected man in town, a landowner, a trader, and a man who carried himself like he had nothing left to prove. He was tall, serious, with the kind of calm that could make anyone feel small. His wife, Margaret, had died when their daughters were still young, and from then on it was said the laughter in that house had gone missing. People pitied him at first, praised him for raising 2 girls on his own. But over time, that sympathy turned into quiet curiosity. No one ever saw the girls outside much, except on Sundays when they came to church, always walking a few steps behind their father, their faces pale and unreadable. The 2 daughters, Eliza and Clara, were close in age, only a year apart. Both had the same pale hair and soft features as their late mother, but while Clara was the quiet one, always looking down at her hands, Eliza had a sharpness to her that seemed to challenge the world. They were beautiful in a haunting way, like portraits that had been painted to look almost too perfect. Their father often spoke for them when people asked questions. "My girls are shy," he'd say, smiling faintly. But there was something about the way he said it that made others drop the conversation altogether. Life in the Ozarks moved slowly back then. People rose with the sun, worked the fields, and measured life in seasons, not hours. The Vancrofts had farmhands who kept to their work, a cook who never looked anyone in the eye, and a housekeeper who left before dark each day, no matter what. She once told a neighbor that she couldn't stand the way the house changed at night, the way it felt too heavy, too watchful. But she said no more after that, and no one pushed her to explain. Inside the house, the air was different. The piano sat untouched most days, its keys collecting dust. The mirrors were covered with lace cloths that looked like cobwebs. The girls kept mostly to the upstairs rooms, sewing or reading by lamplight. Their father worked in his study late into the night, the glow from his lamp visible through the front window until well past midnight. Sometimes, neighbors walking home would see Eliza standing in the yard, barefoot, staring at the light in her father's window. When asked about it later, she said she liked the quiet, that the night helped her think. There was something about the way the sisters lived that felt suspended in time, as if the house itself had locked them away from the world. They were educated, more than most girls in town, but they had no friends, no suitors. Men who once admired them from afar soon stopped coming by. There were whispers that Mr. Vancroft didn't like visitors, that he believed no one was worthy of his daughter's company. He was known to have a temper when crossed, but in public his words were calm, his smile polite. People called him a man of discipline, of deep grief, but others, those who paid closer attention, called him something else behind closed doors. In town, the Vancroft name was both respected and avoided. The girl's beauty was the subject of quiet envy among women and of hushed fascination among men. Yet everyone agreed on one thing: the family's sorrow lingered too long. It had been nearly a decade since Margaret's death, but no joy had returned to that household. The windows were never open. The garden had gone wild. Even the air around their property seemed thicker, as if the earth itself was keeping a secret. Still, life went on. The church choir sang each Sunday. The blacksmith's hammer echoed through the streets, and every so often one of the sisters would be seen at the market buying flour or candles, always speaking softly, always glancing behind her shoulder before leaving. The younger one, Clara, had a habit of touching her wrist whenever someone mentioned her father's name, as though it burned her. The older Eliza only smiled, a smile that was too calm, too knowing for someone her age. There was no one moment when the townsfolk realized that something was deeply wrong with the Vancrofts. It was a slow realization, like watching a shadow stretch longer each day without noticing until it covered everything. People whispered about strange noises at night, music that played even when no one sat at the piano, crying that echoed across the hills when the wind was still. But in small towns, rumors lived short lives. No one wanted to believe something evil could exist among them. Still, the sheriff once admitted that every time he passed that house, his horse would grow uneasy. He said the land around it felt colder, as if it didn't belong to the same world. When the local preacher stopped by to offer prayers one winter evening, he returned pale and silent, refusing to speak of what he'd seen inside. He said only that the Lord's presence felt unwelcome there. For a long time, the Vancroft sisters lived quietly, untouched by scandal or crime, at least on the surface. But beneath that quiet, something unnatural was growing. It showed in their eyes, in the way they moved around their father, in how they clung to him a little too long, and in how he never seemed to notice. Whatever bond they shared had twisted into something darker, something that blurred the lines between love, fear, and control. No one knew it yet, but the calm was about to break. The year 1898 would not pass quietly for the Vancroft family. The truth that had been buried in that grand old house for years was about to claw its way into the light, and when it did, it would leave the whole town questioning how something so horrible could hide behind a name once spoken with pride. By the spring of 1898, the Vancroft home had grown quieter than ever, but not with peace. It was a silence that felt tight, like a held breath. The house seemed to watch itself. Every creak of the floor, every soft knock on the wall carried meaning. Inside, something invisible had started to shift. What once appeared as grief and solitude was now changing into something heavier, an unspoken pull between father and daughters that blurred the line between affection and ownership. James Vancroft's behavior had changed in ways only those inside the house could notice. His patience, once his defining trait, was thinning. He had stopped going into town regularly, relying on servants to handle trade and correspondence. He spent more time behind the locked door of his study, drinking whiskey that he used to forbid. He'd call for Eliza to bring him his meals instead of the housekeeper, saying she understood the order of things. Clara, the younger one, would wait outside the door, listening to the low tones of her father's voice and her sister's replies that sounded too calm, too willing. At first, Clara didn't understand what had changed between them, but she could feel it. She could see it in how her sister's eyes lingered on their father too long, and in how James looked at Eliza as though she wasn't his child but something else entirely. Someone he needed, someone who filled the space their mother had left behind. The house had started to feel divided, one part ruled by her father and Eliza's secret closeness, the other by Clara's growing dread. Their father often spoke of sin and purity, but the words began to twist in meaning. He would read from the family Bible, his tone calm yet strange, insisting that obedience and love were the same. He'd remind his daughters that they were his world now, that no man could ever love them right. Those words settled into Eliza's heart differently than they did Clara's. Eliza took them as truth, as purpose. Clara heard them as a warning. When Eliza was 17, the town started noticing her changes. She dressed differently, her hair pinned the way her late mother used to wear it. She carried herself with a confidence that drew both admiration and discomfort. Some whispered that she looked too proud, too aware of her beauty. The local storekeeper once mentioned to his wife that when Eliza looked at you, it was as if she knew something about you that you didn't know yourself. James encouraged her confidence. He'd compliment her in ways that made Clara's stomach twist. "You have your mother's grace," he'd say, his eyes lingering too long. "She was the most beautiful woman I ever knew, and now you are." Clara noticed how her sister blushed under the praise, how she leaned into it. In that house, love and control had become tangled until no one could tell one from the other. As months passed, the town's whispers grew. People said the Vancroft girls had become too reclusive, that something wasn't right. The cook quit after finding Eliza crying in the kitchen late at night, trembling, her nightgown buttoned wrong. When the cook tried to ask what had happened, Eliza had only said, "He just loves us too much." After that, the woman packed her things before sunrise and never returned. James told the townsfolk that his daughters were too delicate for gossip, that they were mourning in private. And because he was respected, people let it go, but Clara couldn't. The nights were full of sounds she couldn't ignore, doors opening softly, footsteps in the hallway, voices behind walls. She would sit in her room, clutching her blanket, pretending not to hear. Every time the stairs creaked, she held her breath. Eliza, on the other hand, had changed completely. She became possessive of her father's time, jealous when Clara spoke to him, and even cruel in small ways that made Clara shrink inside herself. One evening at dinner, Clara asked about visiting their aunt in Springfield, a harmless suggestion, but Eliza's fork scraped sharply against her plate. "Why would you leave him?" she said, her tone too cold for such a simple question. Their father didn't look up from his glass. He only muttered, "She wouldn't understand how to care for you." Clara noticed that her sister had begun to echo his words, his mannerisms, even his silences. It was as if she'd become an extension of him, a mirror of his desires and moods. James had molded her into something that wasn't quite daughter or woman, but both at once, a creation shaped by grief, obsession, and control. Still, there were moments when Eliza seemed unsure, as though a small part of her still knew how wrong it all was. Clara once found her sister staring at their mother's portrait, her hand trembling as she traced the frame. "Do you think she'd hate us?" Eliza whispered, her eyes glassy. Clara didn't know what to say. Before she could answer, Eliza smiled faintly, turned away, and said, "He says she'd be proud." By summer, the tension had thickened into something unbearable. Clara had started avoiding them both, spending more time outside, walking through the fields until dusk. She found comfort in the stillness of the woods, the chirping of crickets, the distant hum of life that wasn't poisoned by the air inside that house. But even there, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. When she returned one evening, she found her father and sister sitting together in the parlor, the curtains drawn even though the sun hadn't set. They were sitting close, too close. Her father's hand rested on Eliza's shoulder as he spoke softly to her. When he noticed Clara, his expression turned sharp. "Where have you been?" he asked. His tone wasn't angry yet, but it carried weight. Clara froze. "Just outside," she said. He stood, walking toward her. "You shouldn't wander alone. There are wolves in these woods." His voice was calm, but his grip on her arm said something else entirely. That night, Clara lay awake, listening to her sister's footsteps crossing the hallway again. The door creaked open and shut softly. She didn't cry. She just stared at the ceiling, feeling the same silence she'd felt since she was a child, the kind that filled every corner of that cursed house. In town, people had begun noticing Clara's pale appearance and nervousness. The preacher's wife once offered her a chance to join the choir, hoping it might lift her spirits, but James refused. "My daughters don't belong in town business," he said. "They belong at home." And that was that. The invitation was withdrawn. Rumors began to swirl more openly now, some cruel, some fearful. A few townsfolk said they saw James drinking alone at the tavern, muttering to himself about sin and betrayal. Others said they'd seen Eliza by the riverbank one evening, staring at her reflection in the water, whispering something about forgiveness. No one dared confront the family. As the year went on, money began to tighten. The family's once prosperous trade faltered, crops failed. A drought swept through the Ozarks, and the Vancroft's land was no exception. James became more irritable, drinking earlier in the day. He would lash out first at the servants, then at Clara. But with Eliza, he was different. He was soft, almost tender, as though she were his only comfort left. That contrast tore at Clara until the resentment inside her began to turn into something dangerous. She started writing letters to anyone who might listen, her aunt, a cousin, even the local pastor. But she tore them all up before sending them. She feared no one would believe her. In town, her father's reputation still held weight. To everyone else, he was a grieving man raising two fragile daughters. No one saw what really happened when the doors were closed. The breaking point came one stormy night. The rain was heavy, the kind that soaked through walls. The thunder shook the house and the lights flickered. Clara heard shouting from downstairs. She crept out of her room, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. From the hallway, she could see her father's study door open and her sister standing inside, crying. James was yelling words like ungrateful and shame. He grabbed Eliza by the arm, pulling her close, his voice trembling with anger and fear. Clara froze, watching through the crack. Eliza's voice was shaking. "She knows," she said. "Clara knows everything." The room fell silent. James turned toward the door, his expression changing from rage to cold calculation. For the first time, Clara saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than anything, a look that said he would do anything to keep control. She ran before he could come upstairs. She hid in the cellar that night, listening to the thunder and the heavy footsteps above her. She could hear Eliza crying, then silence, then a door slam. When morning came, everything was quiet again. At breakfast, her father was calm. He acted as though nothing had happened. Eliza's eyes were red, her hands shaking as she poured tea. No one spoke. But in that silence, everything had changed. Clara realized then that her father's love was something that could destroy, and her sister was already lost to it. Outside, the world went on as usual. The sun came up, the roosters crowed. But inside the Vancroft house, the air had turned poisonous. There was no more pretending. Every smile, every word carried the weight of something broken. The storm had passed, but what it left behind would only grow darker. And in the weeks that followed, that darkness would finally push one of them to do something that could never be undone. The night it happened, the air felt wrong, too still, too heavy. Even the crickets were quiet, as if the woods around the Vancroft house knew something was about to happen. The moon hung low over the hills, pale and full, spilling light through the cracks of the shutters. Inside, the house was thick with silence. No one spoke at dinner. No one had spoken much in days. Clara could feel something building between her father and Eliza, something that had no words but filled every corner of the room. She felt like she was standing inside a storm that hadn't yet broken. After the meal, James had retreated to his study again, the door closing softly behind him. Eliza sat at the piano, pressing the keys without sound. Her eyes were distant, her hands trembling. The candlelight flickered across her face, and for the first time she looked frightened, not proud, not cold, just scared. Clara watched her from the doorway, her heart beating hard in her chest. "You don't have to stay here," Clara whispered. Eliza didn't look up. She kept staring at her hands. "It's too late," she said softly. The wind picked up outside, brushing branches against the windows. Somewhere deep in the woods, a coyote cried out. It was almost midnight when Clara heard the study door open again. Her father's footsteps moved through the hallway, slow and deliberate. He called out for Eliza, his voice calm but commanding. The sound of it sent chills down Clara's spine. She stood at the top of the stairs, holding her breath, watching as Eliza rose from the piano and followed him into the dim hallway without a word. Clara knew she should look away, but she couldn't. She followed quietly, barefoot, her heart pounding against her ribs. The door to the study creaked open, and she stopped in the dark hallway, listening. She could hear her father's low voice, rough with anger. He was accusing Eliza of betrayal, of talking to someone about what happened in their home. She denied it, but her voice was shaking. "I didn't tell anyone," she pleaded. "I swear." His tone grew sharper. "Then why was the preacher at our gate yesterday?" Eliza started crying, soft at first, then harder. "He just asked about you," she said. "He said people are talking." That was all it took. The sound of a chair scraping, the thud of boots on the floor, and then a loud crash. Clara's stomach turned cold. She pressed her hand against her mouth to stop herself from crying out. Inside, James's voice rose to a terrifying pitch. "You've brought shame into this house," he shouted. Eliza's sobs filled the room. Clara stepped closer, peeking through the crack in the door, and what she saw froze her in place. Her father had grabbed Eliza by the shoulders, shaking her violently. The lamplight threw shadows across their faces, his twisted with rage, hers pale and terrified. "You're mine," he hissed. "You belong to me." Something inside Eliza broke then. She shoved him away, screaming. "I'm not yours, you're sick." The words hung in the air like a curse. For a moment, everything stopped. James stared at her, stunned. Then his expression shifted from shock to something darker, something murderous. He raised his hand and struck her hard across the face. She fell backward into the table, knocking over the oil lamp. The lamp shattered on the floor, spilling fire across the rug. The flames caught the curtains almost instantly. Smoke began to fill the room, curling upward in black waves. Clara screamed and burst through the door. Her father spun toward her, his face lit orange by the fire. "Get out!" he shouted, but Clara didn't move. Eliza was on the floor, coughing, trying to crawl away as the flames spread toward her. "Stop it!" Clara cried, grabbing her father's arm. He pushed her aside, the force sending her to the floor. "This is your doing too," he growled, his voice barely human. The heat was rising fast, the air thick with smoke. Clara coughed, struggling to see. Eliza had managed to stand, her eyes wild, her hair tangled, her face streaked with soot and blood. She reached for something, anything, and her hand found the iron poker by the fireplace. "Stay away from us," she screamed. Her father stepped closer, his eyes burning with fury. "You ungrateful girl," he said, his tone calm now, too calm. "After everything I've given you." Eliza lifted the poker with shaking hands. "You ruined everything," she whispered. Her father took another step, and in that instant she swung. The sound of metal striking bone cracked through the room like thunder. He stumbled backward, clutching his head, blood pouring between his fingers. For a moment he looked almost surprised, like he couldn't believe it had come to this. Then he collapsed to the floor. Clara stared, frozen in place. The flames were spreading fast now, climbing the walls, devouring the drapes. The air was too hot to breathe. Eliza dropped the poker, her face pale and blank. "Clara," she said softly, "we have to go." But Clara couldn't move. She could only stare at the man on the floor, their father, his body twisted, his eyes open but empty. Eliza grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door. They stumbled into the hallway as smoke filled the house. The heat was unbearable. The fire had already spread to the staircase. They ran down, coughing, their skirts catching on the railing. Behind them, the study exploded in sparks. Outside, the cold night air hit them like a slap. The two girls collapsed in the grass, gasping, their faces streaked with ash. The house burned behind them, orange light reflecting off their wide eyes. Clara turned to Eliza, trembling. "What did you do?" she whispered. Eliza didn't answer, she just stared at the flames. "It had to end," she said, her voice hollow. The fire grew louder, cracking and roaring as the roof began to collapse. The neighbors, seeing the glow from miles away, started running toward the property, shouting for help. But by the time they arrived, the house was almost gone. All that remained were two girls standing barefoot in the mud, silent, staring at the inferno that had once been their home. When the sheriff and the townsfolk reached them, the sisters were in shock. Eliza's hands were covered in blood and Clara's eyes looked empty. The sheriff tried to question them, but neither spoke. They were taken to a neighbor's house to rest, wrapped in blankets, trembling from the cold and from something deeper, something that couldn't be named. By morning, the fire was out. The house was nothing but charred wood and ashes. The townspeople searched through the remains, and there, in what was once the study, they found James Vancroft's body. The iron poker lay beside him, blackened and bent. The coroner said he had died from a blow to the head before the fire consumed the room. When word spread through Alton, the town fell into stunned silence. People whispered in disbelief. The Vancroft name, once spoken with respect, was now a curse. Some said the girls had gone mad. Others said the father had finally paid for his sins. But no one truly knew what had happened inside that house before it burned. Eliza sat by the window of the sheriff's office, her eyes blank, her voice barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said. "He said he loved us. He said we were his." Clara sat beside her, silent, staring at the floor. When the sheriff asked what caused the fire, neither answered. The sisters looked at each other, and for the first time in their lives, Clara saw a kind of peace in Eliza's face, a terrible, fragile peace. "He's gone," Eliza said quietly. "It's over now." But Clara knew it wasn't over. The flames had burned the house down, but they hadn't erased what happened inside it. The fire had only made it visible to the world. The truth, once hidden behind those tall windows and quiet dinners, now stood naked and raw. And as the ashes cooled and the morning sun broke over the hills, the Vancroft sisters sat in silence, one haunted by what she had done, the other by what she had been too afraid to stop. The smoke from the Vancroft fire lingered for days. The smell of charred wood and ash hung over the valley like a stain that wouldn't lift. People from nearby farms came to see what was left, whispering prayers as they stared at the blackened ruin on the hill. What had once been a proud house, a place of laughter long ago, was now a skeleton of scorched beams and collapsed walls. It was hard for the townsfolk to believe that something so terrible could happen in the home of a man they'd once called respectable. The sisters were taken into town early that morning, wrapped in shawls, their faces pale and streaked with soot. They didn't speak much on the way. Clara stared out the wagon window, watching the smoke trail behind them like a ghost. Eliza sat beside her, still trembling, her hands clasped together tightly as if she could hold back what she'd done. Neither cried. It was as if all the tears had been burned out of them with the fire. The sheriff tried to keep the story quiet at first, but nothing stayed secret for long in a small town. By midday, word had spread to every shop and farm within miles. Some people pitied the girls, believing them victims of madness or tragedy. Others whispered that they were wicked, that whatever had happened inside that house had been unnatural for years. There were stories about spirits, curses, or the devil's work. The truth was simpler and much darker. It was just human cruelty and love twisted into something monstrous. Eliza was arrested for the killing, though at first, even the sheriff didn't seem sure what to call it. Murder, self-defense, an accident. No one knew where the line fell. Clara stayed with the pastor's family while the investigation continued. At night, she would wake screaming, her dreams filled with the image of her father's blood on the floor and the sound of fire eating through wood. The pastor's wife tried to comfort her, telling her that sometimes the Lord took drastic steps to reveal hidden sins. But Clara didn't believe that. She didn't think anything holy had been in that house for a very long time. When the sheriff questioned her, Clara struggled to speak. Her voice trembled as she told him what had been happening, the strange nights, her father's temper, the fear that had lived with them since their mother died. She tried to explain how Eliza had changed, how she had both hated and loved their father, and how that love had turned poisonous. The sheriff listened quietly, his expression grim. When she finished, he didn't say much, only that some truths were too dark for the law to handle. Eliza's condition worsened in jail. She refused food for days and spoke little. Sometimes she'd ask for her father as if she'd forgotten he was dead. Other times she'd weep quietly and whisper that it had all been her fault. She said she had sinned, that she had let herself believe in a love that was never right. "He said I was his light," she told one of the guards once. "But I think I was just his shadow." When her trial finally came, the courthouse was packed. People came from miles away to see the sisters, the ghost girls, as some had started calling them. The air inside the courtroom was heavy, tense. Eliza sat quietly beside her lawyer, her hands folded in her lap, her hair still singed at the ends from the fire. Clara sat behind her, pale and shaking, watching every move, afraid to blink. The prosecutor painted a picture of a jealous daughter driven by rage, a young woman who couldn't stand her father's authority. But when Clara testified, her voice broke as she spoke the truth. She told them everything, about the nights of fear, the control, the love that had turned into something cruel and twisted. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed shaken. By the end of the trial, no one looked at the Vancroft name the same way again. The once admired family became a symbol of corruption and hidden sin. The newspapers wrote stories that made the sisters sound like ghosts from a Gothic tale, the daughters who loved too much, one headline read. People devoured the scandal, but when the shock faded, what remained was sorrow. The story wasn't just about crime or sin, it was about how silence could destroy a family from the inside out. Eliza was found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. The jury decided she had acted out of desperation, not malice. She was sentenced to 5 years in a women's correctional facility outside St. Louis. Clara visited her once before she was taken away. The visit lasted only a few minutes, but it felt longer. They sat across from each other, separated by the thick scent of disinfectant and iron. "I didn't want to hurt him," Eliza said softly. "I just wanted it to stop." Clara reached across the table, her hand trembling as it brushed against her sister. "I know," she whispered. "I know." For a moment, they were just two broken girls again, sisters who had lost everything, trapped between guilt and survival. When Eliza was led away, she didn't look back. Clara watched her go until she disappeared through the doors, her steps slow, her shoulders bowed under the weight of everything she had done. After that day, Clara never saw her again. The town eventually moved on, as towns always do. The ashes of the Vancroft house were left untouched, slowly swallowed by weeds and time. Children dared each other to go near it, whispering stories about ghosts in the burned ruins. Some said they saw a woman's figure standing by the old well on moonlit nights, her dress white, her hair tangled, waiting for someone who would never return. Clara stayed in Alton for a few years, working quietly for the pastor's wife and helping at the school. But she was never the same. Her laughter, once soft and shy, was gone. She rarely spoke about her past. When asked about her sister, she only said, "She wasn't evil, she was lost." Years later, a letter came from the prison. It was from Eliza. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded. She wrote about dreams of their mother, of the house before it became a place of horror, of the sound of rain on the roof when they were little. "Sometimes I think she's waiting for us," Eliza wrote. "Somewhere better than this." At the end, she asked for forgiveness, not from the law, but from her sister and from herself. Clara never wrote back. She kept the letter hidden in her drawer until the day she left Alton for good. Some said she went north, others said she married quietly and changed her name. No one really knew. But for years afterward, every time the wind blew across the valley and carried the faint smell of smoke, the people of Alton would remember the fire on the hill, the night when the truth of the Vancroft family came burning out of the dark. For the townsfolk, the story became a warning, a whispered reminder that evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it lives inside the walls of the prettiest houses, behind polite smiles and Sunday prayers. Sometimes it wears the face of love. And for the Vancroft sisters, the crime never truly ended. The fire had burned their home to ashes, but the guilt, the memories, and the unbearable weight of what had happened between them and their father would live on long after the smoke cleared. It haunted them in different ways. Eliza in her cell, replaying that final moment over and over. Clara in her silence, trying to build a life on ground still soaked with sorrow. The Ozarks eventually forgot their names, but the wind never did. On quiet nights when the hills fall still and the moonlight touches the ruins of what once was, it's said you can still hear the echo of a girl's voice carried through the dark, whispering, "It had to end." When the dust of tragedy finally settled over Alton, what remained was not just a story of violence, but a haunting reflection of how fragile the human soul can be when love, power, and silence intertwine. The Vancroft fire faded into local memory, spoken about less with each passing year, but its scars lingered in the quiet spaces of those who lived through it. Justice, as the courts defined it, had been served. Yet in the hearts of the people, and in the haunted mind of Clara Vancroft, it never felt complete. Eliza served her sentence quietly. In prison, she became something of a ghost among the living. She spoke rarely, spent most days in the chapel, and refused to let anyone photograph her for the papers that occasionally sought her story. The warden once said that she was the calmest soul in the building, but those who looked closely saw the storm in her eyes. Her body was there, but her spirit seemed trapped somewhere else, perhaps in that burning house or in the moment her father's life slipped away. When her sentence ended, Eliza did not return to Alton. She vanished into obscurity, living under a different name in a distant town. Rumors swirled. Some said she became a nurse, others that she died alone in a boarding house by the river. What is certain is that she never saw Clara again. And perhaps that was the truest punishment of all, to live knowing that the only person who truly understood her pain could no longer bear to face her. Clara, on the other hand, tried to build a life from the wreckage. She carried herself with a kind of fragile dignity, teaching at a small school and avoiding questions about her past. Those who met her described her as kind but distant, her smile faint, her eyes often far away. She found some measure of peace in caring for others, as if tending to children could somehow mend the broken child still living inside her. But every year when October rolled around and the smell of burning leaves filled the air, her hands would tremble and she'd close her windows tight. The fire had ended, but it still lived within her. The people of Alton moved on, but the story of the Vancrofts became a cautionary tale, a dark whisper about what happens when reputation matters more than truth. The newspapers, hungry for sensation, had painted the sisters as tragic figures corrupted by sin and secrecy. Yet over time, the tone shifted. Scholars, pastors, and even lawmakers began to discuss what the case revealed about the hidden lives of families who suffered in silence behind respectable doors. The crime and the circumstances that led to it sparked conversations about domestic abuse, power, and the way society often looks away from the suffering of women. In an era when family honor was prized above personal pain, the Vancroft tragedy forced the community to confront uncomfortable questions. How many other homes hid the same shadows? How many daughters, wives, and mothers endured cruelty quietly, believing that silence was their duty? For some, the story became a warning about moral decay, a symbol of what happens when faith and authority become twisted. For others, it became a cry for empathy, a reminder that even those who commit terrible acts are often shaped by the pain inflicted upon them. The townsfolk had wanted simple answers. A villain, a victim, a reason to sleep soundly again. But the truth refused to be simple. In the decades that followed, the ruins of the Vancroft home were overtaken by wild grass and ivy. Only the stone well remained, half-collapsed and filled with rainwater. Travelers sometimes stopped to look at it, unaware of what once stood there. But among the locals, there was still talk of strange things, a faint glow on foggy nights, or the sound of a woman humming somewhere among the trees. Whether real or imagined, it kept the memory alive in whispers. If there was justice, it came not from the court's verdict, but from the quiet reckoning that followed. The community learned, however slowly, that righteousness cannot exist without compassion, and that silence, no matter how polite or pious, can be as deadly as sin itself. The pastor who once preached forgiveness began holding sermons about confronting evil openly, even within one's own home. The sheriff, long retired, admitted to his grandson that the case had changed him. Sometimes, he said, the law punishes the act but misses the reason, and sometimes that's the greater crime. Clara lived long enough to see the world change around her. She witnessed a time when people began speaking more openly about pain, when women found voices that would once have been silenced. But she never told her story publicly. To her, the past wasn't a tale to be shared. It was a weight to be carried quietly, out of respect for the dead and the living alike. In her final years, she moved to a small cottage near the edge of the woods. Neighbors said she spent her evenings sitting by the window, writing letters she never sent. When she died, those letters were found neatly tied in a ribboned bundle. Most were addressed to Eliza. None had been mailed. In one of the last, written in shaky handwriting, Clara had penned a single line that summed up everything. "We were both his victims, but I became my own warden." That single sentence captured the essence of everything the Vancroft tragedy had come to represent. The cycle of love and harm, the way trauma reshapes identity, and the quiet endurance of those left behind. Years later, historians revisiting the case framed it as a turning point in how American society viewed familial power and female agency. The crime wasn't just about one night of violence, it was about the conditions that made that night inevitable. The story of the Vancroft sisters became an unintentional mirror for the times, a study in repression, faith twisted into control, and love that became possession. Even today, in the corners of forgotten archives, the Vancroft file stands as both a tragedy and a warning. It teaches that justice is not always about verdicts, it's about understanding. It asks the eternal question, when does survival become sin, and when does silence become guilt? The Vancroft sisters will never be saints or monsters, only human, flawed, fragile, and shaped by forces far larger than themselves. Their story endures because it touches something universal, the human hunger for love and the destruction that follows when that love is poisoned by fear. And so the tale ends not with redemption, nor with condemnation, but with reflection. The fire that consumed the Vancroft home may have burned out long ago, but the lesson it left behind still smolders quietly in the conscience of anyone who dares to look too closely at the darkness within the human heart. For in the end, the story of the Vancrofts is not just about death or justice. It is about the terrible cost of silence, the frailty of morality when bound by fear, and the enduring truth that the line between victim and sinner is far thinner than most would like to believe.